Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Mel's Genealogy Show on Monkey in My Tree. This is the first full-on episode that we've had in quite a while, and for this episode I wanted to just kind of go over a few things that are good to know if you're just now getting interested in genealogy, and some things to consider before you even get started doing the research. Mostly these are things that I kind of had to come back to because I just delved right in, and then as very quickly into it I started to realize that these were the kinds of things that I should have thought about beforehand, because it made it a little bit more difficult to go back and fix those things. So let's go ahead and get into that. So one thing to consider, one of the big things to think about when you're thinking about genealogy is, what all are you wanting to research? Are you just wanting to learn about one particular branch of your tree? Some people prefer to just trace their actual surname and that lineage. Or do you want to trace your whole tree, or do you just want to trace your mother's line or your father's line or whichever? The more you choose to take on, the more work it's going to be. But it's really up to you as to what direction, how much you want to take on. When I first started, I chose my mother's line. I was specifically interested in all of the lines from my mother back. Being as how I didn't know my biological father, all I knew before I started any research was his name, and that's kind of a generic name, so I had nothing to go on really. I had initially just started with my mom's line. But then I looked at my tree and I was getting all of this stuff, but when I looked at it, it looked very lopsided because I didn't have anything on my father or his line. So ultimately, I worked with my mom and we were able to find just enough information for him through the internet, for him and for his parents, to where I was able to kind of fill out the tree beyond that. I haven't gone into any kind of details as far as any living people, as far as I know, whether they're living or not. And what little I still mostly concentrate on my mother's side, but I do get a little bit more interested in my biological father's side, going a little bit farther back, like second grade, third grade, and so on, grandparents. So it's really up to you. Most people that really get into genealogy like to do the whole thing. And you do have, even if you only go up a particular, like you just want to do your surname, for example, even by doing that, you still would probably need to do a little fringe research to be able to get more information on that line. But you can just do your surname, or you can do your whole tree. You're going to want to figure out what you're wanting to do in your case, what you're the most interested in. At least to start with. You may change your mind down the road, but to start with. Another thing to take into consideration is, how are you going to keep up with your research? Now, that it may not seem like, especially if you only want to know so many generations back, or you just want to know one particular line and you don't think you're looking into that much, I can assure you that when you start doing the research, your documentation is going to pile up really fast. And so it's best, before you even begin, to figure out how you're going to keep up with it. Are you going to use an online software or an offline software, or are you just going to keep up with it through paper? There are different methods for keeping up with your genealogy. I personally choose to use an online family tree, especially at this point, where I can cite my sources. Many of my sources are internet based, so I can just put links to those internet based sources. And then I could just cite any other sources, books, and so on from there. And so that's my preferred method, and I prefer doing it online because I can also, as far as the farther back generations, I can make that information more public to where it's out there, and that potential other cousins and other lines might find it, and we can collaborate together on this common ancestor of ours. In a way that we wouldn't have known of each other's existence if I didn't have that information on the internet. It's a pretty standard rule to keep any living relatives either offline or just very private where it can't be searched. Some people prefer to keep their entire family tree information completely offline, and that's up to them. And then there's still some super old school people that that actually have been doing this for decades. And so most of their research is in paper form, and they stick to the paper and keep printing out more paper. For me, that's a little bit too pricey for what I'm wanting to do. But it's all in, some people like to have that actual tangible document in their hands. So whatever your preference would be, but that's something to consider before you get started. Because when I first started, I had like a stack of papers going, and then I quickly realized I didn't have a way or a will to store paper documents for all this stuff. So once you have an idea of what you're wanting to trace and how you're going to keep up with your research, the next step would be to determine what you already know. For me, I already knew my mother, I knew her parents, and I knew the names, basically, of each of their parents. And that was pretty much where that was the extent of what I knew. And even then, my grandmother's mother, I didn't know her maiden name when I started. I didn't really know much of anything about that whole, either my grandmother's parents. And a little bit more about my grandfather's parents. I actually know his mother. She's still alive and well and kicking. And I have vague memories of his father, but he died when I was pretty young. So that was kind of where, I jumped off, or where my knowledge of my family history dropped off. So that's where I started. It was enough to get me started. It's a little bit harder to get you started if the only thing you know is your parents or less, because with living or recently living individuals, the information is a lot more private for obvious reasons. So your ability to get enough information to be able to move back to that next generation is a lot more complicated. But for me, I knew enough to be able to say, okay, I can look back far enough to be able to look at records that aren't infringing on somebody's current privacy, or isn't infringing on someone's current privacy, and to be able to look back farther in my family history. So I was kind of fortunate in that respect. So what you want to do is you want to figure out who you know, and then you want to take that information and put that information in whatever means by which you're keeping up with your history. So in my case, I went with the online family tree, a free online family tree website. And I just popped in what I knew, and since that's the information that I knew, I sourced it as being first-hand knowledge by myself, or at least second-hand information from another relative that I knew that had been already told to me up to that point. And those were basically my first sources. Before I had any physical documents, my first sources were myself, basically. And that's where you start. And if you're doing your history by paper or offline softwares, however those systems work best for you to document that information, you want to go ahead and put what you know first. Now, another thing to take into consideration, particularly if you're putting your actual research out there on the internet. So a lot of people will do their research offline, and then once they feel like they've got, to their standards, enough information, they might put it online at that point. Me, I figure it's always a work in progress, so I just went ahead and put it online. So the main thing you want to do if it's going to be public information, or if it's going to be available publicly for anybody to look up, is you want to make sure you cite your sources. There are countless family trees all over the internet where you've just got people putting people as parents, but they might have their sources in their files somewhere at their house or wherever, but you can't see their sources. So most people that don't know that much about genealogy research or haven't really delved into what is and what is really important about it, or important about the validity of claims, is that if somebody just puts a tree online, well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate. And it doesn't necessarily mean that person that put it online is trying to mislead anybody. It's just that it's better to put your sources out there, and then perhaps another person might look at those sources and say, well, did you consider maybe this might be the cause of that? Or at the very least, that person could say, oh, okay, so you actually have something that supports this information. It's not just repeating something somebody else said that may or may not have been accurate. So while I never discount a family tree that I come across online, I always just kind of take it with a grain of salt until I can get sources that support a family tree. So when I started doing my family tree, I actually was putting the sources with the tree that's online. And in addition to assisting other people, for me, it also helped that as I'm building and collecting all these documents and these sources, to actually physically put the sources in the source information on each profile I created for these people. And then I could go back and look at them all together and say, oh, okay, well, I can see a pattern forming here. Especially with census records, you can see how they've moved throughout their life, if they moved at all. So source citation is very important for both you and for anybody else looking at your research. And another thing I've already touched on a little bit is privacy issues. You want to be very sensitive to the privacy of your family members and particularly of living relatives. You don't want to put, even though that information from a family history standpoint is very important to document, you don't necessarily want to put all of your parents' business up on the internet, So you want to be very careful about privacy. The website that I use, it has different settings, different privacy levels. So you can put everything on there, but you set it to different levels of privacy depending on what it is. So if you're going to be sharing your family history information online in particular, or even if you're on your own and just to share it with people, with friends and family, you do want to take into consideration the privacy of the people that you're researching. I generally stick with the deceased relatives, and I don't really do a whole lot with my living relatives. And I think that just comes more because I'm more into the history of genealogy than the keeping up with the family business part of genealogy. More interested to know how my ancestors fit into all the historical things that have gone on throughout history. So for me, I tend to I don't say disregard, but I don't put as much emphasis on living people in my family as far as the family history goes as I do the deceased people. So that's pretty much going to cover it for this episode. If you found this episode helpful or informative in any way, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos or keep up with future videos from us, you can go ahead and subscribe below. We are also online. For those of you who've been subscribed to my channel for a while now, you may recall we did have a website that was monkeyinmytree.com, but as mentioned in the last episode, that website no longer exists. It turned out it was too much to kind of keep up with my other projects. So I actually ended up including Monkey in My Tree as a part of my other blog, which is a more broad-based blog called Random Considerations, and it's at randomconsiderations.com, which is linked below. So there's a genealogy section on the website, and in that genealogy section, you'll see more about Monkey in My Tree and everything we've got going on. I also offer genealogy services for those who, for whatever reason, aren't able to do the research for themselves, or just don't want to do the actual research for themselves. It's a $30 per hour rate generally. I do offer the occasional discounts, but that's kind of the regular rate. New customers are required to do a 5-hour minimum, and that's mostly because since it's a new account, it takes that extra little bit of time of getting everything started and set up and kind of getting that initial family tree going. And then after that, anything that comes after that would be on an hour by hour kind of basis. And then you can also check out our other YouTube channel, Random Considerations, where I have episodes that go into some of my other interests. Gardening, food, traveling, whatever I happen to think about to do an episode on. That's kind of where that goes. So you've got Monkey in My Tree, that's for my genealogy, and then for everything else that I'm interested in, I have a channel for that at Random Considerations. So if you're interested in that, that'll all be linked down below. Let's go ahead and check all of that out if you would like. So that's going to be it. Thank you for watching and have a great day.